This week's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is brought to you by StarCityGames.com and the StarCityGames.com weekly sale, where this week, from Monday, January 17th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time to Sunday, January 23rd at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, all variant art cards are 15% off. All those cool, pack-openable, or box topper alternate arts are at a discount. So stop in and get your Crimson Vow Dracula variants or your Modern Horizons 2 sketch variants at StarCityGames.com/sale. That's SALE. If you just want your cards with their normal art, don't worry, because a new sale starts each Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Stop by StarCityGames.com/sale every Monday and take a look at our great deals on Magic the Gathering, singles, sealed products, and supplies.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 40 of Dominaria's Judgment, a weekly modern podcast brought to you by StarCityGames.com. I'm Dom Harvey, I'm here with Ari Lax, and this week, we may be walking back what we said last time about the format condensing around a few select decks, because people are wilding out here in the challenges this week.
Well, actually, I was going to say it in a different way, because it feels like we're condensing around two of those three decks, and then some other nonsense is happening in the background. The kind of spoilers, there's not a lot of Hammer this week, and it feels like there's a lot more Prismari Command and Force of Vigor, which are like the two cards that really kind of push back against Hammer, which sort of means that the like average deck in the field is probably plus a few percent against it, which really, when you're playing a deck like that has like an inherent fail rate and like sometimes just like loses because its opponent does stuff in a specific way and it can't interact, those percentage points are like hard percentage points and really cut into its ability to win events.
Yeah, we had focused on this trifecta of decks at the top tier of Modern. You have Hammer, you have Shadow, you have Four Color, and the three of them are in this weird equilibrium with each other, and then also limiting what the rest of the format can do to attack any one of them. So you can really go hard to try and be Hammer, but then you're probably weak to at least one of Shadow or Four Color, and that is true of all three of them to some extent. And I'm not going to say this is a called shot necessarily, but we did touch on this possibility last week of what if the thing that disrupts that is one of the three getting pushed out or at least kept down for the time being. And it looks like that actually is going on with Hammer here.
Yeah, and I think there also is just like an interesting follow-up question to ask about like, well, then what beats Grixis and Four Color? Because there's a little hint of that this week, and we'll get to that, but like not a big hint about what really beats both of those decks at once. So let's start with the Saturday challenge, where we did have a very unique winner. Someone has started to sort of successfully make the Glimpse Cascade combo deck into something that is functional when it doesn't resolve a Glimpse.
Yeah, which is much easier said than done in my experience. But it looks like that formula may finally have come in the hands of Zenowan, who we had touched on here and there across the months as, you know, someone top 8ing with the old builds of Glimpse of Tomorrow occasionally being the only person keeping that thing at all on the map. And now maybe this will go down as the deck's breakout weekend if this build has any staying power here, because this is a very interesting list.
Yeah, so this list features Karn the Great Creator. And there's a weird thing where there's only 3 Shardless agents because you can Karn for a Shardless agent to keep the chain going. One thing that has been kind of dropped from this list is there used to be some Goblin Dark Dwellers in some of the older lists, and that's just like not happening because Karn sort of represents that ability to chain by finding the Shardless agent. I will note that there are some funny screenshots out from people who play this deck and then hit the oh no moment, which is when you resolve a Karn, find a card with Karn, cast a Glimpse, and then shuffle that card back in and go to Cascade again. And then suddenly you're like, why is there a liquid metal coating on the stack?
Oh, yeah. I think my favorite example of this is we have the Elixir of Immortality in the sideboard here, which has its obvious applications against Mill or Burn, for example. It does also theoretically let you go infinite with Cascading, but because Elixir itself costs 1 and it shuffles itself back in, you will get into these situations where you have 1 Cascade spell left over and you just hit the Elixir again. And usually once the game has got to that point where you're trying to hit the 7th Glimpse of the game instead of the 6th, you're probably fine. You're probably just running out the score and didn't need to do this in the first place, but just something to watch out for if you find yourself going through those motions.
Yeah, it again, good screenshot equity, but winning equity is definitely sacrificed in the process of that. So do look out for that.
Well, that was the entire tagline of this deck before, was great screenshot equity, but not so much about the winning equity. But that second half may be about to change, and the screenshot equity is undiminished. There have been a lot of streamers picking up this ball and running with it today, and a lot of them seem pretty impressed by the deck. And it is easy to be impressed if your incredibly small sample size of your one league or whatever goes well, and this is one of those decks where when you are firing on all cylinders, it's like, well, this thing is hopelessly broken and why would you do anything else? But the fail rate, when it makes itself known, is a reminder and an answer as to why. But I do like a lot of what is going on here. So with Khan, for example, this is a backup plan of sorts. It's not a great one because you can't cast Khan all that quickly and you can't defend it that easily either. And so those were two of the things holding back Khan in most of its fair applications in the past. That being said, it does do some very specific things here that you have an interest in. So one thing that it does is cleanly answer Chalice of the Void, which was a much bigger issue 2 or 3 months ago than it is right now. But if that card starts picking up again, because all of the Cascade decks, all 3 of them now, have been picking up again this week, then maybe that will become more relevant again. It does also, as you say, give you redundancy on your combo by getting you the Shardless Agent from the sideboard. And so you have a high impact wish target, if you like, for your Khan. And that also means when you glimpse into the Khan, that lets you keep chaining together glimpses and going again. And then also, it's just a high impact permanent to hit off your glimpse, where if you have to short glimpse and you get maybe a Khan and then 1 or 2 other creatures, it can vary whether or not that's enough to win the game. But the Khan often is going to be enough to swing that in your favor, whether it's against a linear deck, some of these graveyard decks that have been picking up this week. You can find the Tormod script. We have an Esika's Chariot in the sideboard, which is really interesting here, where that's just a good backup threat that also adds 3 new permanents to the battlefield for a follow-up glimpse. And you can get like an Engineered Explosives against Crashing Footfall, stuff like that. So a lot of cool stuff that the card does in their shell.
Yeah, I think the fact that your glimpse lands enter the battlefield untapped really opens up the world to what Karn is going to do after you do a short combo. Moving on from there, we have a pretty stock, the top 4, we've got, is it mid-range with Murktide Regent, minor flex of like there's a Snapcaster Mage and a Prismari Command and the second Dress Sound on the sideboard. Not a lot there. Pretty stock Death Shadow deck in 3rd. Burn in 4th with pretty much the typical stuff that you'd expect. A couple Skull Cracks as opposed to other cards, which sort of implies that the 2 Lightning Helix versus 2 Skull Crack really implies that you're trying to beat other decks and not any sort of mirrors. And then we get to the 5th place with Spider Space, always a delight to read off their decks. And we have the 4-color Indomitable Creativity deck, representing a return of Prismari commands to the metagame. But in this case, it is a slightly different kill condition. There are 3 Archon of Cruelty in the deck. No persist anywhere, just Archon because entering the battlefield is good. That's what's going on.
Yeah, I almost don't know how much your choice of creativity targets matters past a certain point. It feels like winning once you resolve creativity is not really the hard part. It's more about the, can I find my creativity, which has always been a sticking point for these decks? Can I resolve it? And then can I fight through any, other disruption that comes along with that? And if it's almost like if resolving creativity isn't enough to win you the game, then the whole endeavor is a non-starter to begin with. And I don't know what the pros and cons are for Archon, let's say, over the classic like Sarah's Emissary plus Emrakul setup or anything like that.
I think it's just sort of admitting that if you have to go off for one, it's splitting the difference between the immediate kills of an Emrakul or the old Velomachus Lorehold setup versus the sort of stability of the Sarah's Emissary. I think that Archon just kind of lets you play single stop shop, not have to worry about hitting the wrong card on the wrong half when you creativity for 1. It just kind of is the natural conclusion of this card is good at defeating my opponent and making me not die at the same time.
Yeah, we also have some black lands in this mana base for the 4/5 colors, and that's not just for the stretch goal, I guess, of eventually casting Archon of Cruelty. We also do have 2 copies of Thoughtseize in the sideboard here, so we do have the 4/5 colors in a mana base held together by fetch lands and Ren and 6, as always.
What, you weren't really interested in Prismatic ending a 5 mana permanent? I actually can't even name a it's like Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, and then like everything else costs 2 or that's not going to happen. But everything else makes sense, what you said.
I can hear the solitude that's been in their hand since the start of the game, waiting for me to resolve my creativity. So it finally, it has something useful to target there. But I think usually what happens in those situations is you've drawn like several copies of Dwarven Mind, and the idea of casting ending for 5 seems as remote as ever.
Yeah, that's very fair. The All Mountains 5-color mana base is a little sketchy at times. And then moving on to 6th place, go off, Dom.
It's me with 4 color elementals here. No sneaky 5th color finding its way in there. So this is basically the Yorion elemental deck that Canister had been messing around with last week. And so I basically just took that deck and added more of the cards that were in the existing 4-color deck. So it seemed like Ren and 6 was a natural fit for my deck that really desperately needs to hit every single land drop and needs more red cards to pitch to Fury, and ideally needs a few more hits for Oath of Nissa. Just really does a lot of things, that card, as it turns out. But yeah, I think that this isn't... I don't think this is the official return of Elementals by any means. I don't think this is necessarily better, or maybe even contextually better than just the stock 4-color list, which we will be going into with a perfect guest in extensive detail in our main segment here. But I think that this kind of idea makes a lot of sense when if Fury in particular is very good, or if Cavern of Souls in particular is very good. And those are 2 opposite conditions for the most part, but they do overlap a little bit. So against the 4-color mirrors, for example, both Fury and Cavern of Souls pull a lot of weight there. And then with this setup, I have Ella Damri's Call, 3 copies in the main deck, and the 1 Emrakul the Promised End in the sideboard. So you have a lot of access to that. So I think this might be a good way to attack the other 4-color decks, but you do give up some points elsewhere. You don't have a lot of the generic answers like Counterspell or stuff like that.
It is interesting how little you really have to shift. Like, you cut the Eternal Witnesses for Risen Reef, and you have some Mold Drifters, and like you're basically the same deck for a lot of the other slots. So I think that there's room to flex to maybe buy back some of that ground. Subtlety probably isn't the entire way back. You have one of those, you could maybe play a couple more, but I don't quite know what the fix is, but like it feels like there is something in there that could shift, probably at the cost of some other cards or like consistency in the form of Oath and Nissa.
Yeah, there is actually a classic Elementals deck with Kahira and Flamekin Harbinger and a lot of the old school stuff a little bit lower down these results. And that the main distinguishing feature there is that list is really going hard on subtlety. They think that card is well positioned at the moment. And Mold Drifter, as much as it pains me to say, may be the worst card in this list. It just it still felt a little clunky. And I think the format went through a phase where somehow Mold Drifter was all the rage for like a week and a half, and then that died down again. It's great when you can pair it with Ephemerate. I don't know how often that really comes up. Didn't come up for me much in the challenge, but I think the rest of this shell is, if you want to play Elementals, this is like a nice natural evolution of that shell.
Yep. Moving along this top 8, we have Mill showing up as well. And Azorius Control with 1 Chalice of the Void, something that is probably important when you consider the fact that Cascade won this event and 9th place was Crashing Footfalls. Chalice really isn't in a lot of places these days. It used to kind of just like show up as a 1-of in a bunch of sideboards or a 2-of. There's fairly few Flusterstorms across these lists. It feels like a good time to be playing Cascade. Though I don't know, like, it felt like one of the edges of that deck was that it was one of the good Force of Vigor decks. And it feels like with everyone else moving to Prismari Command or Force of Vigor in other ways, you might just be like trying to look for the edge of like, I don't know, slam some rhinos and hope that's better than what people are doing.
Yeah, I will say that the blue-white control decks that leaned hard on Chalice against the Channeler and Ragavan decks, that was at a time when the Channeler decks hadn't really discovered Torak yet, which was one of the things that really put the hammer on blue-white, so to speak. And it's very plausible that you resolve a Chalice on one and you blank half of the hand, and then you just lose to a kick Torak anyway. And then also, outside of that, the Shadow decks these days have other ways to bob and weave around a Chalice. So you can still lose to either Croxa by itself or Croxa with Dress Down, or they have their Colligan's commands. And they don't have a lot of those, but like if they manage to line that up properly, then that's kind of a disaster. So I think Chalice, there was a time only a few months ago when Chalice was an appealing reason to play a deck, and finding the best Chalice shell seemed like a priority for a few given weekends. I don't think that's the case anymore, but if you get to be a good Chalice deck, then that's still a nice selling point.
Yeah, I still like the card against Grixis, but I also have like this inherent rule where I also don't like, I like it, but it's also like a weird liability. And I understand that's sort of like why it's limited in numbers. Like you'll see 1 or 2 copies in these Azorius decks and not 4. Just because like always being a Chalice deck means that like you're always going to run into the bad Kolaghan's Command lineup, or like just get buried by Expressive Iteration and Croxa in the games where they just like, so you've discarded a card to cast Chalice. Here's what the rest of my hand is going to do to you. So I think you have to do it in small doses, or again, as the sideboard card that you would maybe want against the Cascade decks.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess rounding out the Saturday challenge, we have the return of Crashing Footfalls. Not quite sneaking into this top 8 here, but LeCancer in 9th place with just good old-fashioned Team of Rhinos, a bunch of Bonecrusher Giants, Brazen Borrowers, Seasoned Pyromancers, Furies, just everything we've seen before, really.
Yeah, Dead Gone. I feel like there was a point in time where the list sort of dropped that card in some capacity. It feels fairly important if you need to clear Croxa or Death Shadow, so access to some number of it seems really good, as well as the fact that it's just like the best way to handle a turn 1 Ragavan. So I might be interested in a third copy somewhere, but I think that would have to come out of the Bone Crusher or potentially Prismari Command slots.
Mm-hmm. And then beyond that, a lot of it is just names that you recognize, playing the decks that you recognize them for, and maybe a card or two changes here and there, but nothing too notable beyond that.
Yep. What about the Sunday? Should we start with the challenge or the Super PTQ?
Let's go to the challenge here, because that also was won by a deck that came a bit out of left field. And this is the Azorius Urza, but oh wait, actually, no, it's not Urza deck that I noticed Seif has been streaming with and refining a little bit. And, a few other people have picked this up, and it claimed its first, big bounty this weekend. And it's kind of hard to describe this deck, really. It's honestly more of a Nettlecyst deck than anything else, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, it's like it's sort of got the 8 cast shell from like Legacy or Vintage going on, but like with the weird clunky modern cards, which then bridge it to be a Nettlecyst deck. So it's got Esper Sentinel, Ingenious Smith, Thought Monitor, Thoughtcast, Metallic Rebuke, Nettlecyst, and then like a typical spread of artifacts for an Urza Saga deck. Portable Hole, some talismans, because it is weirdly a 22 land deck with Urza Sagas, but like also like weird mana requirements. So and then like an Urza Saga spreadsheet of options. It is certainly, I feel like there's work to be done on it. Again, this feels like an almost disrespectful number of lands, but I like some of the things that it's trying to do to break away from what the old artifact decks were doing that potentially got them into trouble against Grixis Shadow.
Yeah, I'm not quite seeing how these pieces all fit together at the moment, because as you say, this is not like a really dedicated 8-cast deck where you're playing a bunch of these zeros like a welding jar or whatever. This list doesn't even have the full 4 Mishra's Bauble. We only have 3 copies here. And so you're not racing to those card draw effects to then draw more cards and try and chain those together. And so I think you're going to end up in a lot of these mid-game situations where you're like casting a 2-mana Thoughtcast, and that's drawing you a Metallic Rebuke, which you can't easily cast and which maybe doesn't even counter their spell anymore, and an Esper Sentinel, which was like relevant on turn 1, but that card really has steep diminishing returns. And the reason it's so good in decks like Hammer is that that deck compresses the game so much that Esper Sentinel is almost always relevant. Like if they're casting spells, you're probably getting at least one card back from it. In this deck, that's not really the case. I think you can often afford to just ignore the Sentinel and stagger your development a bit and play around it some amount of the time.
Yeah, I think that it's more here as like somewhere in the middle of like a land and a action that you're taking for the turn, just to like fuel your 8 affinity cards, because you literally are an affinity deck. I do really love the Hurkyl's Recall on the sideboard, which like obviously it's good against Hammer, but it's like, but what if I play the Mirror? I am so prepared. It's just really funny to me to see that.
That's the long con, is you win the challenge with this deck. So shout out to Frisky Frasker here. And then next week you show up with even more Hurkyl's Recalls and you get an edge in the Mirror. The mana base does scare me a little bit with this one too. Like I'm looking at these Esper Sentinels and we have, by my count, I think it's 4, 6, 7. We have 9 ways to cast it on turn 1, which feels very low for that card. And 22 lands where you have 4 Saga, 3 Darksteel Citadel, and Academy Ruins, 4 Razortide Bridge, which I get why it's there. Like it's kind of obvious, but at the same time, the drawback is pretty obvious there too. I'm just not convinced you can cast your spells very easily, or that those spells are that good when you're casting them.
Yeah, that is sketchy. I think that once you have registered Razortide Bridge, like you're like, well, casting stuff on turn 1 is just out the window. Let's just talk about turn 2. There is like a good argument that this deck makes Razortide Bridge enough of a enters the battlefield tapped Ancient Tomb that it's worth playing, which it makes sense. But yeah, I agree with you basically on all counts with land count and like weirdness of your mana curve.
I do really, yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm realizing with the Hurkyl's Recall what their top 4 matchup was to get them to the finals, and we'll get to that in a second. But it actually may have been good value to play a Hurkyl's Recall.
Oh God, yeah, wow. I will say I do like the focus on Nettlecyst as your big top end threat here, and top end does mean 3 mana in Modern these days, where like this is often going to be a 4/4 or a 5/5 when you cast it, and then later on. You put that thing on a Sentinel, the Sentinel now is massive, and removing the Sentinel is basically guaranteed to get you back a card, or you cast a turn 2 Ingenious Smith, that finds the Nettlecyst, and then the Smith itself is growing at the same time, and so they kind of have to point removal spell at everything. And then the end game, of course, is you just put this thing on a Thought Monitor and go to town there. So I think Nettlecyst is a really good card to build around, and I like not having Urza itself as a sacred cow for these decks. But I don't know if this is how I'd fill out the rest of the deck. I think there's more work to be done there. Yeah,
so seeing Nettlecyst in this deck does sort of remind me of the non-Luris Hammer deck that was sort of like a 9 Nettlecyst deck with Stoneforge and Steel Shaper's Gift. And it makes me wonder if this is an example of a deck that is starting to exploit the hole that Hammer being pushed back has left in the metagame, though. It feels like this is losing to a lot of the same things as Hammer does. So your mileage may vary there.
Yeah, speaking of losing to Force of Vigor and, related cards, let's talk about the Lantern Control list that made it to third place here.
Yeah, so that is what, in fact, lost to this affinity list. It is Lantern Control. It literally looks like 4 Urza Saga, and you have teleported your deck from 2016. I guess Prismatic Ending. Do you feel like this is an exploit for Shadow or for 4-color, or did it just have, a good weekend with a reasonably powerful strategy?
I'm going to be honest, I have no idea. Lantern is one of those decks where it's so hard to envisage how it lines up against any new opponent that you just have to see it in action, and like no one's streaming Lantern these days. Canister, who made a name for himself in 2017, 2018, just streaming Lantern for 8 hours a day. Even he is not playing Lantern anymore. So it's really hard to get the reps in unless you're willing to do that for yourself. And maybe that's a task I need to add to my list for the upcoming weeks. But I think that against a deck like Shadow, for example, I think it's really sensitive to how many Colligan's commands you expect to play against. And in the past, like Boomer Jund was the issue for this deck back when it was first becoming popular, where like when they had a bunch of discard and K commands and other relevant interaction, like Abrupt Decay, which nowadays I guess it maybe is stuff like Prismatic Ending instead, depending on the opponent, and also just other problematic stuff. It's one of those spots where weirdly, like the old school dinosaur Jund deck with like Bloodbraid Elf and Liliana is actually more of a problem in some weird ways than the super low to the ground, super efficient, play all the good cards list where, yeah, they have a bunch of good cards, but do those good cards answer the problem against stuff like Ensnaring Bridge or the Lantern Lock? And the answer is no in most cases.
Yeah, I think that my experience playing against this deck has been that I just like accidentally defeat them because I drew a Prismatic Ending, or like Luris plus Bobble or Expressive Iteration is like, there's just like a lot of weird ways around the Lantern Lock these days. Just like cards that will like, it used to be like your opponent would have to like spend cards to hit relevant cards and then like be out of the cards that would get them anywhere unless they're playing Tron. And I don't necessarily think that's the case these days. There's also like the very stupid interaction where like they can Lantern Lock you if they hit the right card off of Ragavan. Like,
oh yeah,
you just can't cast Lantern if they've like hit a Codex Shredder at the right spot. Like it's gonna be a disaster.
Hey, you can sacrifice your Lantern, you can shuffle it away, but you know you wonder why you made the life choices that got you to this point.
Yeah. It's probably really good against like the Izzet mid-range deck that got second in this event that has like 2 Blood Moon main, which like even though it's breaking up all the mana, like this deck probably doesn't care for the most part. Like, you know, I guess maybe it's non-functional with only 17 real lands, but I don't know. It's just a race to Ensnaring Bridge, and then they're not going to really beat you if you resolve that card. Mm-hmm. In like jumping down a slot, in 4th place we have pretty much stock Cascade Rhinos, the hands of Belfi, mostly known for playing the Temur Living End deck, like the hardcore, like whatever the 11/11 that's like Titanoth Rex, yes, or whatever it is, that version. But they've switched to just making 8 power trample, like another matchup where like the Lantern deck like feels like it should be favored because they're just trying to attack you with creatures, but like you just look at it's like Brazen Borrower and Prismari Command and Force of Negation, sideboard into Force of Vigor. This is, I don't know. I'm heavy caution to anyone playing Lantern. There's also 4 Glimmer Voids in your deck, and that's just always been a nightmare these days too. Heavy caution, but it does feel like Ensnaring Bridge is having better lineups these days.
One thing that's very good against both Lantern and Temur Rhinos, and this is a common sideboard card that you catch some splash damage from, is Engineered Explosives, actually, which maybe that's going to be on the downtick a little bit now that Hammer is falling back for the time being, but just something else to be aware of. I do like the Leyline of Sanctities in the sideboard here, and this is part of an increasingly common recipe that we saw a lot this week against Shadow, where for these linear decks that can dodge most of the non-discard interaction against Shadow, like if you're Lantern, you don't care about stuff like Unholy Heat, Fatal Push, or anything in that space. The only things you really care about are the discard, and then conditionally stuff like Drown in the Lock, and Leyline turning off the discard lets you mostly just do your thing without any interference. And so we kind of saw the same thing from the Oops All Spells decks, and some of the other combo decks on the same principle. So that's a trend to be looking out for too. I will say, I am excited to see the bellification of the Glimpse of Tomorrow deck when they try their hand at that, because I don't know what's going to be in the deck other than 2 copies of Bonecrusher Giant. Those ones are a mortal lock.
I am excited to see that. I do want to jump back to 2 specific sideboard cards in the Lantern deck. The Spellskite, I know we talked about Karn in the, you mentioned the Glimpse combo deck. I've actually... So in the context of being able to like Karn for an Ensnaring Bridge or playing Ensnaring Bridge, Spellskite's like a pretty awesome card in the format. Also, like the way it messes up Prismatic Ending against the cheaper artifacts, like it forces them to overpay in the first place and like not like get through in any kind of like great way. I'm a pretty big fan of Spellskite as the protection card over like a Welding Jar. I know this list splits the difference because it can search up with Urza Saga, but I would advise people to look back into Spellskite weirdly. And then Kaya Orzhov Usurper feels like a card that maybe deserves more of a presence in the metagame. I don't really know how Grixis Shadow beats that card.
Yeah, that one is it's not a common card to see, but when you do, it has a very clear purpose in mind. And with the mana curves in the format becoming so compressed, the bar for a 3-mana Planeswalker is much higher, but the thing that 3-mana Planeswalker is doing is so much better that I think it gains on balance there.
Yeah. Jumping down, we have 2 no-land combo decks in the top 8. We have a Belcher deck, which is mostly traditional, plus some main deck Furies. And then Sodek in 8th place with Oops All Spells with, it looks like it did get a slightly upgraded kill condition with the Jack-O-Lanterns. There's like some rebuy Thassa's Oracle Memories Journey thing going on because you have access to double blue via your exiled Jack-O-Lantern from your graveyard ability. But we haven't seen a lot of that deck in recent months, I guess year now, since the banning of Simian Spirit Guide. It is interesting to see it showing back up. And maybe these feel like decks where, like, I guess you have Force of Vigor against Hammer, but it feels like you are sort of playing the worst version of the combo deck in the Hammer matchup. And if Hammer is not a part of the metagame, maybe the Shadow matchup can get a little sketchy. But if you're just like beating up on 4-color, it's a lot easier to say like, oh, I'm, maybe sketchy against Shadow, but really good against 4-color, instead of like, I'm good against this 1/3 of the format and against the other 2/3. It's a lot easier to argue that like, no, I'm just hitting up 4-color, don't play against Shadow twice in the same event, and like beat up on everything else because they're middling.
Yeah, I could see this deck being favored against Shadow in game 1, honestly. If you leave them with a bunch of blank cards and you have 8 Informers plus buys and then some Goblin Chart Belchers to their, 6 discard spells, I think you win that exchange on balance, especially as I think one crucial aspect of this deck is Drown in the Loch is actually very bad against it because you're not putting any cards in your own graveyard and your combo payoffs cost 3 or 4. And so it's pretty unlikely that they can actually line up a Drown in the Loch against, the thing that they really need a counterspell for. And so if you can get game 1 most of the time, and then you have 4 ley lines, I imagine you don't want Prismatic Ending there. It's more of like a piece of counterplay to specific, like graveyard hate pieces. But I think you have the tools there to, you win game 1 most of the time, and then it's not that difficult to get a post-board game. And I think that might be a good recipe. I do think the Memories Journey, Thassa's Oracle, Jack-O-Lantern angle adds this new aspect to the deck where against one-shot graveyard hate, so the entire Relic, Soul Guide Lantern, Lantern of the Lost family of cards, this beats the other lanterns basically, because what it does is you mill your deck, they have to use their one-shot graveyard effect to sweep your graveyard, stop you bringing back a bunch of Vengevines and triggering Creeping Chill and winning on the spot. And so in response to that, what you can do is flashback Memories Journey, shuffle Thassa's Oracle, and then ways to cast it if you need those back into your deck, which is now comprised of just those cards effectively. And so when you redraw the Thassa's Oracle, if you have enough time to do that, then you're going to win then on the spot. So it gives you a new way to kind of combo twice, if you like, and force them to have two ways to attack your graveyard in one go. The interesting thing is one of the primary ways to interact with graveyards in the format right now is Endurance, where this actually doesn't do anything against, because if they're Endurancing your whole graveyard, well, all of that's going back on the bottom, and now you can't clear all of that and then find the Thassa's Oracle in time. That being said, the flip side of that is if they're reshuffling your whole graveyard back in, then you can, in theory, just combo again if you have another Spy or another Informer, except that with this list that Sodek used to get to the top 8, there are some weird breakpoints along the way there where, for example, if your Narcomoeba comes into play and they allow that to happen, the Sword of the Meat triggers go on the stack. If you Endurance at that point, those get shuffled in, and now there's no 1/1 left in the deck to mill to trigger those swords again. And so those are kind of stranded in limbo there. Likewise, you can get into these spots where if you can let them get the Salvage Titan back and cast it and put it on the stack, you can let that resolve, but Endurance away the Vengevines again. And so you might lock out the Vengevines, from ever being cast, because the Savage Titan usually is the second creature being cast in the turn to bring those back. So lots of weird corner cases where Endurance is like better or worse than you expect it to be for whatever reason.
Yeah, I was thinking through the case where like you just Memory's Journey in response, and that's when the Belcher goes on top of your deck, and then they shuffle the Endurance cards underneath that.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting. Yeah, I will push back a little on the Shadow statement. I think that the Shadow deck actually doesn't always. So one of the things the Belcher deck is specifically good against on the discard front, and like it loses to Shadow specifically on races usually. But what that deck can do is, because specifically of Strike It Rich and all the rituals, it's a little more resilient to the lines where like they just take one of your lands. And it feels like if you're leaning on talismans, things that are a little harder to rev up, as well as I haven't done the exact land count, but I wouldn't be shocked if like the color imbalance was a little weirder here. I would not be shocked to see this deck having issues with the Shadow deck being able to choose which side of your cards they choose to discard, whether they go after, you have one Informer, so they go after that, or they just like, okay, well, you don't have an Agadeem's Awakening. Good luck finding black mana.
Yeah, this was something that Doomwake ran into trying the deck, I think, for the first time earlier, where I think he kind of absentmindedly played the wrong DFC, and now is, oh god, if they draw Inquisition or something, I just can't cast my spells anymore. So it definitely something to be aware of there. But I think this is a smart choice, and you know, Sodek is a name who you see succeeding with combo, even when combo has no right to be succeeding. But the logic behind this deck and what it's trying to do makes a lot of sense right now, I believe.
Yeah, and rounding out the top 8, we have pretty traditional Ragavan decks. Another Murktide deck. This is the Fury variant that people have been testing with, that just like it has 2 Fury in the main deck. That's the special thing. And then pretty stock Grixis Shadow. Past that, I think the only thing that I want to sort of pop up out of the lower results is Burn is having a better weekend again. You know, like a 9th place or 10th place, like top 16 finishes, a few other popping up, which is, you know, a couple weeks ago, we had mentioned that during the Showcase Challenge, it literally had the worst possible weekend it could have. And it's kind of interesting, and I'm not entirely sure, and this may just be that Shadow is eating up more of the metagame share, and that deck is like notoriously atrocious against Burn in its current iteration, and they also have cut all their collective brutality, so that may just be like, I'm going to eat this one matchup, and every other matchup, I'll just like try to do my thing and hope it works out.
Yeah, and this might be where the downfall of Hammer, if that's what's going on, contributes to that too. But I think that is, some people say that's a close matchup for Burn, but of the big 3, I think that's the one you certainly want to face the least. And so if Hammer is on the decline, then maybe that's good news for Burn. That being said, I don't know how much Hammer really is on the decline. And this is where it makes sense to look beyond the top 8 and look at the top 16s, top 32s, where for this challenge, for example, we don't have any high-profile Hammer results. There's none in the top 8, and then the highest one is in 14th. But it is still the most popular deck in the top 32. And so to get to this stage of the tournament, you did have to slog through probably at least one match against Hammer. And so even if the deck is, for right now, not having the kind of success where in the past it was, you know, you could guarantee at least 2 spots in every challenge top 8, it's still there, it's still present, and you still need to have a good plan against it.
Yeah, it just feels, the only thing that it feels like is people have shown up with the cards that are actually good against it for a weekend. And that seems like it's pushing back, but you will have to play against Hammer still in the other rounds of the event.
Yeah, let's finish this out here with the super qualifier then. Because for as much as we're highlighting some of these wacky deck choices that are showing up here for the first time, this tournament really is more of the same. And I don't know if that reflects a different vibe or a different level of competition here in the super qualifier versus just the ordinary challenges. But this tournament very much is Shadow. You know, we have a Shadow Mirror here in the finals, and then 4-color and Hammer. I mean, it's the big 3 from top to bottom here.
Whoa, top to bottom. What's 3rd place? I want you to read off the text of Rotting Rats.
So in 3rd place, we have noted brewer Cave Dan with Crabvine. So in that similar space of graveyard decks exploiting a lack of hard graveyard hate, or just if Dredge is good, then Crabvine usually has ambitions to be good at the same time, but I think different cards line up against those decks differently. But this is, I know that Cave Dan has been very high on Otherworldly Gaze in basically every deck he can put it in, since that card was spoiled in Midnight Hunt, and putting that, putting his money where his mouth is here, that card does seem very well positioned in this deck in particular. Just another 1-mana enabler to get things going.
Yeah, the reliability, actual volume of mills is really important with this deck, because it's not like Dredge where you're like, oh, I've hit the one thing, I'm just going to put my entire deck in the graveyard eventually because I have a stupid repeatable effect. It's like, no, I actually need to hit whether I mill 16 cards or 26 cards is a pretty big difference over the course of the game. Big shout out to the One Wonder in this list, by the way. Just very glad to see that card again. 20 years later, it's more. It's been a while.
Yeah, sadly, the MH2 version doesn't have the Judgment graveyard indicator in the top left. So as and when Paper Magic comes back and you're rifling through your graveyard looking for this, just get the old school copy. It looks great in that old frame. And then also, we got that little cheat sheet in the top left-hand corner there to make things easier.
Yep. Fourth place, though, is sort of traditional. It's not Grixis, not Shadow, but it's basically sort of the same thing as the Grixis, not Shadow deck. It's just there's no red cards. It's just blue-black Lurrus control that's Snapcaster Mage, Turok, removal, counterspells. It really looks the same as the Grixis deck without iteration there.
This is a hard control deck, basically. This is 4 Counterspell, 4 Archmage's Charm, 4 Drown in the Lock. We've got 2 Inquisition, 2 Thoughtseizes here, so a split of discard in the main deck. A little bit more removal, some explosives, some Bloodchief's Thirst, and then to finish out the games, we have 1 Hall of Storm Giants as one of our 20 lands here, and then 3 Snapcaster Mage and 2 Torok Dreadcantor. So that's a card that we've seen these various proactive black decks pivot to against blue, white, and 4-color, but it makes some amount of sense here where if you need a finisher that's compatible with Lurrus, there aren't that many good options if you're in straight Dimir, and this is one which is pretty good across the board if you have time to cast it. And then also, if you do get paired against 4-color or blue-white, then this is, your best sideboard hate card just in the main deck doing good work for you.
Yeah, I guess I do like the use of engineered explosives with Lurrus in the main deck as a way to really power through the more efficient decks. Hammer and Rhinos are going to have issues with that. Maybe I was wrong to classify this as quite the same as the TSB Yendrick Grixis deck, but it feels like it's in the same lineage.
Yeah, in particular, Explosives is good coverage against Urza Saga in game 1 because the spreading seas here are in the sideboard, only 20 lands and demanding mana requirements. You can't really fit anything like Field of Ruin, and so the card Urza Saga is very difficult to interact with, and that poses a problem for a purely reactive deck. So Explosives can do some work there, would maybe like to see a dress down or two find its way into the mix, and then the 4 spreading seas in the sideboard just a necessity to shore up that weakness.
Yep. The top 8 is fairly varied. We have Tron showing up again. Nothing too new. It's still Tron. Cascade, Rhinos is still Rhinos. And then 2 different 4-color decks, but one of them is the sort of more stockish ephemerate list, but sort of splitting the numbers. And this is our guest today of Leviathan 102. And then 8th place is a more varied sort of Eladamari's Call list, but splitting with Quarter Calling. And that's interesting. Wall of Blossoms showing up again. Yeah,
this is Karusu. And if that name means anything to you, then you know what I'm putting down here. But it is always a treat to see this player's list crop up in the league deck list or whatever, because they religiously play this blinky creature heavy 80 card Yorion deck, and it's always fun to track the evolution of what 6 cards do they change up this week and which of those changes persist through these future iterations. And the earlier shells here were very heavy on these creature tutoring effects. So you would often see 4 Call of Calling alongside a bunch of one-offs in the deck. Here we still have a bunch of one-offs, but we've also gone down to 1 Call of Calling. So we don't have the toolbox element here. We're just trying to draw those cards, and I guess we can make that happen over time.
Yeah, this was the player who I think at one point on an episode I described their Wall of Blossoms, Wall of Omen split as the new the new type of mana fixing, because Wall was tapping for Chord and the other Wall was pitching to Solitude or something like that.
That sounds like something you would say. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Just there's some stuff going on. Two expressive iteration is a number.
Well, there's that. There's 2 Lightning Bolt, 1 Unholy Heat to hedge against something in some ways. Not quite sure what there. Just a delight from start to finish. I will say one final word on the Crabvine deck is this is a kind of linear graveyard deck that gets to play 4 Force Negation in its sideboard and 2 Subtlety even as well. So if you think those cards are well positioned, then that is one thing that Dredge kind of lacks is, I guess you could play Fury or something in the current builds of Dredge, but for the most part, you don't get to enjoy those frankly overpowered pitch spells from MH2 and MH1, and this deck really takes full advantage of those, so that's nice to see.
Yeah, it is. I think that you also could access Force of Vigor if you wanted, so you do have the full spread of broken free cards out of the sideboard. That's probably something we should see these graveyard decks really leaning into. Shout outs in the top 16 to the Berenton Forge Tender Nettlecyst Hammer list that won a challenge a couple weeks ago. Same player in 11th place here. Any top 16 decks you want to shout out?
I guess I would just shout out the 2 copies of Death Shadow that met in the finals. This deck has continued to perform at a very high level, despite all of the rest of the format having to attack it by necessity at this point. Also, in particular, do want to shout out Zagatak23, who I watched win a just truly incredible match against Tron, the other deck in the top 8 that we didn't mention here, to lock out the quarterfinals. And Zach, after top 8ing the Pioneer Super Qualifier the day before, started off strong in this event, took his first loss, and then immediately declared that he was quitting Magic for the rest of the year to focus on school, and then promptly just won the PTQ. So now the retirement plans are called off, or I don't quite know what's going on there.
Yeah, that's how it works. You declare you're going to retire, and then you win. But it only works if you're under the age of 28. At some point, they actually let you retire.
Yeah, at some point, you just are retired whether you like it or not, and you have no say in that anymore.
Yeah, they call that being truly washed, but some people come out of it. Huey has won a million things after retiring. I guess you have to go into full retirement for a while. That might be the trick. And then you come back.
Yeah, which he has now. He'll emerge from his stint at WotC ready to go again in 5 years' time. But I think that the real innovation here from Zach is putting off that maneuver in the middle of the tournament, because usually when people declare their retirement, it's in advance. It's, okay, well, yeah, this is my last tournament, or I'm not going to play any more GPs after this or whatever. It is, I've never seen it before where someone retires at 4-1 in a PTQ of all times, and then just goes on to win the thing and, has to walk it back instantly.
That is really impressive. I have not also seen the mid-event retirement. That is something else. Mid-event, still live for top 8. I'm declaring my retirement. That's just asking for something to happen.
Yeah, not even X2 with middling breakers and you assume you're dead and then you prepare the twit longer post or anything. No, it's you're still live to win the tournament, and then some amount of the time the danger is you win the tournament, and surely that's what happened here.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that, any closing thoughts before we start talking about the 4-color decks that made the top 8 of this challenge, and talk about the thing that may be able to unseat Death Shadow in some capacity?
Yeah, I guess the picture is a little bit more mixed than certainly I gave it credit for last week, where I think the big picture story here is still, Shadow is dominant in the format. Still a lot of 4-color, and Hammer is there, if not having the same success as it once was. It seems like there are other things you can be doing, though, and the players who did that this weekend got rewarded, and credit to them. But one of the best things to be doing still is just to play all the good cards and to play 4-color, and we'll learn how to do that after a short break here.
If you are looking to sell your Magic the Gathering cards, it's never been easier than selling to StarCityGames.com. With a 30% store credit trade-in bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry, there's no reason to sell to anyone else. Visit StarCityGames.com/sell That's SELL for details on all 4 of our great ways to turn your cards into cash or credit. Check out our buy list to sell specific cards, ship your cards to us for an offer with our ship and sell program, schedule an appointment with us at Star City Comics and Games in Roanoke, Virginia for the classic experience of selling to a person, or if you are a store or have over 500,000 cards to sell to us, we can come to you. Visit starcitygames.com/sell for more details on your preferred way to sell your cards, and let us make it the easiest and best experience selling Magic the Gathering cards that you have ever had.
And we're joined now for our deep dive into 4-color blink, control, money pile, whatever you want to call it these days, by Levi Sprung, who you will see week in, week out, crushing the Magic Online events and also the paper events as of recently at the end of last year. And Levi, I know that anyone who has played much Magic Online recently will recognize your screen name, if not the person behind it. So give us a quick background introduction to yourself as a player.
So thank you for introducing me, Dom. My name is Levi Sprung. My Magic Online name is Leviathan102. I'm a freshman in college, and I play a lot of Magic Online. Originally, I started with Amulet, and I played a lot of that and had some good results with it. And then recently, I've been starting to try to expand my range and play more different decks in different formats. And most recently, getting a Super PTQ top 8 with this 4-color blink deck that we're about to talk about. And that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I know that some of the other Zoomers had made this New Year's resolution to put down the 6/6s and play more good cards this year. And you started doing that yourself and been handsomely rewarded for it so far.
Yeah. Yeah, Amulet's not the best thing to be doing right now, for sure.
Yeah, I have to agree, as much as that pains me to say. So when you were trying to expand your range, this has been one of the top decks in Modern in some incarnation for a while now. What was it that drew you to this deck in particular, and what was your entry point for getting acquainted with it?
Well, I think it kind of started with like the 4-color Kahira deck that I was working on with Isaac Bullwinkle, or Bullwinkle 6705. It was just mainly because he likes those sort of control decks with a bunch of good cards, and he like started pressuring me into like playing the good cards and listen to Alan Wu and all that stuff. And then we eventually like moved to 80 cards, and then I played PTQ with an 80 card list with no Ephemerate or Eternal Witness, and I went 7-2 in that. But I felt like not playing those cards was a mistake, and then I added those, and then there you have it. I was playing the Blink deck that had existed for a while at that point, and I just like jumped through a bunch of hoops to finally get there.
Yeah, I remember when the present form of 4-color Blink first arrived on the scene. It took one of the Modern challenges by storm, and looking at that first deck list, it really was just all of the good cards, and then also this weird Blink sub-theme grafted onto that, and it was quite the sight to behold, and trying to analyze that from first principles for the first time. And yet, looking back on it now, it seems like it should have been more obvious than it was, maybe, because we were fiddling around with all of this elementals nonsense and Risen Reef and so on, which was kind of in a similar space. And then we also have that history from last year of these 4-color good stuff Uro Omnath piles, and it feels like just splicing the best elements of both of those decks together for the Modern era that was always going to be successful. It was just a question of who arrived at that conclusion first.
Yeah, like it's weird. The thing is, like, Modern's card pool is so big, and with a deck like this, there's just like so much customizability and flexibility that it's really hard to like arrive at. There's so many deck building decisions, so it's very hard to like arrive at an optimal list, and it's also very hard to gauge that because you're playing like a 95 card. You're playing 95 cards instead of 75.
Are those small differences when you're testing out a new card, or some new iteration of the deck has just done well in a challenge or something, and you're taking that for a spin? Do those differences make themselves acutely felt, or is it more that they're kind of supported by all of the other good cards that you're playing, all of the other stuff going on, and it's quite difficult to untangle the impact of, I have 4 Fury for this prelim instead of 2, that kind of thing?
Yeah, there's definitely like the effect of like you're playing 80 cards, so like one small change isn't going to make that much of a difference. But I think it's like, and like to an extent, as you said, you're going to get like carried by your good cards. But I think the main thing that I realized was that the issue with the deck of like last week, the issue with like last week's build was that it was too clunky. So like trimming on Furies and adding like another Lightning Bolt and trimming on Ephemerates to make the deck less clunky, while also having access to some of that stuff in the sideboard for for the matches where that's good, was something that I liked doing. But overall, it's kind of hard to like draw conclusions directly from gameplay. Specifically, like smaller patterns, you kind of have to look at the bigger picture, and then in like theory crafting and talking to other people, then you can look at like more smaller decisions and theorizing those.
I think that example of the sideboard ephemerate is a really interesting one, because that's a tactic in the deck whose place is up for debate at the moment. Going back a few months, you saw this with the full 4 ephemerate and a bunch of Eternal Witnesses, and really leaning hard into that angle as much as possible. Recently, I think the stock lists have mostly been shaving down on that. You see 2 to 3 ephemerates and then fewer witnesses than you're used to. And all of that stuff tends to be in the main deck. And then to the extent that you're hedging for those matchups in the sideboard, it's usually with these more explicitly dedicated tools. What led you to that conclusion of, I still want access to high quantities of this, but I don't necessarily want all of that in game one?
So I think I like, when I played that 4-color deck with none of the Blink package at all, that was the same tournament that Zach Dunn won with 4 main deck Ephemerate, 4 main deck Eternal Witness. And that just kind of goes to show like how busted that package can be. And he was like very confident that those are some of the best cards in a lot of matchups. But they're also a liability versus, Ephemerate can also be a liability versus Grixis. So what I wanted to do was just like I guess have access to the cards for the potential, because in some matchups Ephemerate's like one of the best cards in the matchup, if not the best, whereas in Grixis it's pretty embarrassing. It can just look like a dead card when they like Thoughtseize your when they like Inquisition your Eternal Witness, or they play around the Solitude or whatever. So like that the card's nature, it's such a polarized card. So having that in the sideboard, where it's really good in some matchups, really bad in the other matchups, made sense to me.
Yeah. So we've talked about how Ephemerate is in most of the list, but has its different roles. There's a lot of cards that also seem to show up in basically every list. Are there any spots where like the Omnas or Solitudes or Wrens or Teferis are things you would consider trimming along the lines of like the Blink package, or are those pretty much set in stone?
That's a good question. I think that when I'm looking at the deck, there's a number of cards that I just like put into my deck by default. And those are the 29 lands, 4 Abundant Growth, 4 Ren, 4 Iteration, 4 Teferi, 4 Omnath, and 4 Solitude. Like those are the cards that I don't think I'm going to leave home without in this deck. And 4 Ending, if I didn't say that already.
Yeah, that card is quite good. You had mentioned Lightning Bolt as like a parallel to Ending, as a card that you had picked up more lately. Is that very specifically trying to break up like Ragavans and the Hammer setups, or are there other spots where like you're leveraging it to kill Planeswalkers, things like that might not be immediately obvious, as the card is sort of turned into a weirdly more conditional removal spell?
Yeah, I think the reason that I added all 4 Lightning Bolts was the main reason was that was for the Grixis matchup. But the card like just tends to not be very bad in a lot of other matchups. Like it's good versus Hammer. It's not great in the mirror, but it can come up. And in a lot of like against a lot of other creature decks, it's very good. and it just usually finds a way to have some value. It's a classic generic good card. It's Lightning Bolt.
Yeah, there's also that classic experience with these Lightning Bolt decks of you're in a matchup where it seems like the card should not be good. You know, you're not picking off any cheap creatures with it. And yet, because of that, you need to find a good use for it. And it ends up just shaving a turn off your clock out of nowhere because you bolt them and then you know, in a lot of these decks, it's Snapcaster Bolt. Here it's Witness back your Bolt, play it again. And suddenly, you know, your 3-turn clock becomes a 2-turn clock. And that ends up making all the difference in the game in the end.
Yeah. Like, an interesting thing is that the matchups where Bolt would be a dead card as like a removal spell or whatever, you're often just like trying to race them while having a requisite amount of disruption, like attack with 1/1 Coatls or 2/1 Witnesses or 4/4 Omnaths and try to fetch twice in a turn to deal 4 more damage. Maybe even like put a 3/3 double strike into play on turn 1, and like Bolt going to the face is super relevant there.
We touched on the Ephemerate package, and against the top tier of Modern at the moment, and we'll come back to that descriptor in a second, it seems like that package is clearly very good against Hammer and at its weakest against Shadow. It seems like its role in the mirror or the pseudo mirror is a little bit more unclear and dynamic. So what role do you see it playing there?
I think that Ephemerate is very good in the mirror, mainly with Eternal Witness, but it can also be good with Icefin Coatl. The main downside of it is that your opponent's playing for Teferi Time Raveler, and it's very bad versus that card. But there's one spot in like round 1 of the PTQ where I drew both of my Ephemerates, and I had an Eternal Witness in play. And I just like Ephemerate my Witness, and if my opponent has like any removal or any sort of interaction, I could just Ephemerate it again. And that gives you such a big advantage in the mirror, just being able to set up Ephemerate plus Witness. Like the mirror is, in my opinion, kind of hard to get a handle on, just because there are like a number of things that matter, but it's kind of hard to figure out which one matters the most in a specific spot. But Ephemerate can sometimes just be a 1-mana divination, which is something that you are pretty happy with.
Let's go into a little bit more detail on the mirror, because as you say, there are so many things that could matter, and it can be hard to identify what does matter at any given time. And the thing that makes that more difficult is you have to do that quickly, because time is an issue in the mirror too. Certainly online, and I imagine in paper as well. You need to know what your plan is from the outset, and then also be able to make these turn-by-turn decisions fairly quickly. And so if you don't have the reps in just yet to be able to do that, mostly going off intuition, what are some of the shortcuts or the heuristics that you use to arrive at that more quickly?
So I think that the most important cards in the mirror are Renin 6 and Omnath. Omnath's mana production in the mirror is absolutely absurd. Fury is also very good, since it can often like pick off like a Witness, a Coatl, maybe pick off a Teferi that's down ticked, or start pressuring a Renin 6, or just like kill a Solitude. Like it's a surprisingly good card in the mirror just to cast, or maybe to Ephemerate. In post board, Emrakul is of course very good if the game goes long, which it usually does. And Teferi Time Raveler is a card that you want in play, and you want your opponent to not have in play, because it just means that you have so much more control over the pace of the game and what actions are being taken.
Yeah. So you do, on the subject of things that do get shut down by Teferi, you've biased towards Counterspell. I know in the past lists have had Dovin's Veto. Is that largely just a concession to the metagame shifting and Cascade and Azorius being less of an issue, and sort of needing to counterspell Omnaths in the mirrors, or like a late Luris out of Shadow or something like that?
Yeah, I think that Counterspell is just like a better card. Like you said, they're in the mirror, creatures are very important, like Omnath and Fury, and especially Yorion. And Counterspell a Dash Dragavan is very relevant too. Because if you can't answer Dash Dragavan, it can sometimes just take over the game. But Counterspell being able to answer that is is going to come up and can win you games.
Yeah, you mentioned that it can be tough to figure out what matters turn by turn or in specific situations in the mirror. What about when it comes to deck building? If you knew that you were going to have to slog through a ton of 4-color mirrors all day, and that does seem to be the case in a lot of the high-stakes modern tournaments at the moment, how would you bias your main deck and or your sideboard to deal with that?
I was talking to Kane Reinhardt about this, and this is where like the one of Colin the sideboard comes up, because I think that in addition to the one Emrakul, Call is the next best sideboard card you can play in the mirror, because it's going to likely have value in the early game to get Omnath, or in the mid game to get Fury, or in the late game to get Emrakul. So I think that playing Call gives you an edge there, as well. Playing additional of Ephemerate and Witness and Fury is going to help. Counter spells are good there. Some people have been playing Mystical Dispute a bit. I've played that before. And hitting it to Teferi or an Omnath with Dispute is just insane. But I think that the card loses value as the game progresses. So it's not like the type of card that I'd want to play just for the mirror.
Looking at your list from the PTQ, you do have a Celestial Purge in the sideboard, and that has obvious applications against Shadow, for example. But when you say that the most important cards in the mirror are Renosix and Omnath, then those are two prime Celestial Purge targets right there.
Yeah, in the PTQ, I didn't actually bring it in. I don't even think I thought about bringing it in for some reason. But I do think it is quite good I imagine it's quite good in the mirror. Someone mentioned that Purge was one of the important cards in the Uro Omnath mirrors, because in those matchups, Omnath and Renosix were also very important cards to answer. And now it can tag Fury too. So I do like Purge in the mirror.
Mm-hmm. So looking at the top tier, you have this kind of three-way fight going on between Hammer and 4-color and Shadow. Is that where the format is, in your opinion? And how do you see 4-color fitting into that dynamic? Because it seems like the story of the last week or two is Shadow and 4-color have been keeping Hammer down a little bit, and those other two decks in Shadow and 4-color have mostly risen maybe to their own tier a little bit above, and are now kind of duking it out to be the undisputed champion.
I think for the most part, I don't think there's. I think for like maybe the past month since Soulstrung hasn't had his insane weekend, or insane couple of weekends with Shadow, I don't think that 4-color has seen quite as much play as Shadow has, and now Hammer is seeing a downtick. So I think that makes Grixis Shadow the pretty much undisputed most played deck in the format, and the deck that you should expect to see the most. I think that more people should be playing 4-color, because I think that it is pretty solid against Shadow and a very good against Hammer, and pretty solid against the rest of the format. So I am not quite sure why it isn't seeing quite as much play. But yeah, I think that overall, I would expect the top 3 played decks in any tournament to be Grixis, Shadow, Hammer, and 4-color.
Mm-hmm. So we'll take a short break quickly, and then we'll come back and get into some of those other matchups that are all important in Modern at the moment.
This week's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel, your first stop for Magic the Gathering inspired stylings. Visit coalesceapparel.shop to pick up a t-shirt inspired by fan-favorite Magic personalities, a hoodie from your favorite guild in the Ravnica University line, or just signal your intent to snap Keep in the Dark with an anti-Mulligan Mulligan Club sticker. Want a splash of a commander deck? Check out the Keep in 100 sticker line and see if your favorite commander shows up there. Whatever you order, use code SCG at checkout to save 10% on your purchase at coalesceapparel.shop. Coalesce Apparel. Nobody made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
Okay, so let's get into the non-mirror matchups that you're going to have to face to win any Modern tournament at the moment. Let's talk about the Shadow matchup, because when you look at some of these 4-color lists, the sideboards tend to be as flexible as the main decks are. You have a kind of 1 of here, a 2 of here. One of the recent trends we've been seeing is 4 copies of Veil of Summer, which to me seems like a loud statement about how important it is to be good against Shadow. how tough that is, that you do actually need some help in that matchup, and that this is the best way to go about doing that?
Yeah, so the main slots that I'm not going to be considering changing for the noticeable future is the 4 Veil and the 2 Relic. I think that Veil is probably the best card in most situations in versus Shadow, since hitting discard spells and Drown in the Lock just is like really important to protect your other cards, because your cards are overall more impactful than theirs, except they have disruption to prevent your cards from being effective. And a big thing is like Veil of Summer so that they can't discard your Yorion or counter your Yorion is huge. And Relic is also pretty important because it's good against Drown as well, by hitting both graveyards. It can tag Kroxa, it can shrink DRC, it can tag Lurrus castables as well. So I think those 2 cards are the best cards in the matchup. Relic is not a card that I'm probably want to play more than 2 of, mainly because it has tension with Eternal Witness. So having to pop it and then draw Eternal Witness is always going to feel pretty awful. But it does. It is an important card to play for sure, I think.
Yeah, one of the stories beneath the top tier going on this weekend was a lot of graveyard decks coming out of the woodwork. So Oops All Spells, which I know you had this nail biter match against to top 8 the PTQ, and then the Crabvine deck that actually got 3rd in this PTQ, coming so close to clinching that invite for Cave Dan. And there are a few other similar decks in that space as well. So with that in mind, do you like those matchups enough to not want to increase the graveyard hate count any further, or would another Relic or maybe an Endurance or something like that be useful there?
I have no data whatsoever on the Crabvine matchup. I've never played it before. I have to imagine that it's not great, since they can just like go so wide, and they're also pretty resilient. So your interaction may not be super good against them. But I would consider like maybe going having 2 calls in the 95 and playing an Endurance, so that you have a bit more ways to interact with these graveyard decks.
I know we had kind of skipped this over in the deck building section, but I noticed you're kind of like splitting the difference on call. I know other people have had mixed opinions on whether they really like it in the deck, and the lists are split about 50-50. You want to cover like where you specifically really like that? Because, we're starting to talk about matchups where like you liked it in the mirror and it's good against the linear decks. I assume it has some of the same ephemerate style clunkiness issues against Shadow, but I don't know, like Hammer, it seems kind of important to be able to just have access to a Solitude at a lot of different times. So where is it really shining in the sort of one of sideboard capacity?
Yeah, so Call is probably the card in the 75 or in the 95 that I've had the hardest time evaluating, just because the evaluation of cards like Call, which you have to use other slots to play, like with Call, you should probably play like a Knight of Autumn and Endurance, like that just like adds another level of complexity to it as well. Like it can sometimes feel like a bad use of mana, which could be awkward versus Grixis, but I'm not really sure that's like exactly what the matchup's about. Maybe like getting an on that they're a witness is going to just be good enough there. So like overall, I'm not really sure, but I do think it is quite good versus in the mirror and versus Hammer and versus and pretty much every matchup where one of your bullets is going to be good, like where Knight of Autumn's good, where Meddling Mage is good. Maybe if Tron sees more play, you could play an Obsidian Charm off and call for that and ephemerate that.
Mm-hmm. Going to some of the fringes of the format, is there any stuff, either specific cards or strategies that worry you as a 4-color player? Because on paper you have answers to everything, and that's part of what makes a deck so strong and so versatile. But especially the decks that don't really care that much about stuff like Solitude or Lightning Bolt. It feels like you're leaning hard on cards like Counterspell to kind of cover all of your bases more widely, and stuff that can kind of sneak through that net might be a bit of a problem.
Oh yeah, so I think that most of these decks that these like random decks that 4-color can struggle with, tend to get pushed out of the format by either Grixis, Hammer, or both. But I think that Dredge can be kind of a tough matchup because the interaction just doesn't line up well. Belcher is a notoriously bad matchup for this deck. Counterspells do carry some weight there, but all of your removal is pretty much dead. And those are the two matchups that come to mind for me when I think about decks that this deck is pretty weak to.
Yeah, you do seem like you have a strong matchup against, at least, in some percentages. I don't know how much margin you actually have against Shadow or Hammer, but it does seem like the 4-color deck is like at least favored, especially with the heavy focus on Icefang Coatl, and that it's really on the metagame at large to push back and select the decks that beat it, as opposed to just kind of like shifting to another really high tier deck. Do you feel like, I'm thinking about some of the decks that are sort of like, I don't know, a tier and a half down. Like, I assume the Murktide Regent matchup is an easier version of the Shadow matchup. But like, what about the like Yawgmoth or like Crashing Footfalls matchups, those, or Burn, like the three sort of more notorious linears that are kind of scraping at the tops of the results, but not quite in that 4-color Shadow Hammer trio?
Yeah. I will say that the Murktide matchup, they could sometimes get you with an early Blood Moon. That's like the most scary thing about it. But the Rhinos matchup, I think that it's probably close to even, maybe slightly favored. Having more counterspells helps. And Ephemerate's pretty good in the matchup because sometimes you can just like Ephemerate an Elemental and kill 2 Rhinos. And of course you have Fortune Fairy. Burn is a kind of weird one because I feel like most of the sideboard cards that you can play for Burn, like Lightning Helix or Core Firewalker, they just like don't really have the applications anywhere else. So the matchup's probably slightly unfavored, except you are playing for Omnath, so you can just like buy some time and then play an Omnath, gain 4 life every turn, and that they just can't beat that. And then Yogg is a matchup that I haven't really played very much, but Fury is very good there. Sometimes they can just like play a Dork, play another Dork and 2 Undying Creatures, and then cast a turn 3 Yogg. And like, what do I do? Am I supposed to like? Was I supposed to Solitude a Dork? They have so many Dorks. Am I supposed to like? I Solitude the Yogg now, it's just going to draw like 4 cards. So sometimes there's starts that are resilient to a single piece of interaction can be pretty good, but they also, a lot of their cards don't do much when they don't have a Yogg in play. So just having counter spells for that is pretty nice.
Yeah. So it sounds like you are relatively comfortable against the top tier and the decks right below it. Sort of predicting things that could happen to shift the metagame, aside from like people start playing Belcher and it becomes an absolute nightmare. Are there any things that you can kind of lead off with as like, if the metagame turns towards, I don't know, Amulet Titan or Living End, like how would you change your list? Like what would you shift up in advance to kind of adjust to those decks coming back into the metagame?
Dress Down was a card that I was considering for the PTQ. And that is a card that is super, super powerful versus Amulet. Like, if they're playing Cultivator Colossus, it just Cryptic commands that, and it gets through Cavern of Souls. Countering the Titan Enter the Battlefield trigger is very good paired with removal. Killing Saga tokens is very good there as well. And it's also pretty nice versus Hammer. And Aether Gust is another card that I've considered and does have value versus Amulet. And then Living End, I think the main thing that you could do is you could play additional pieces of counter magic beyond the 4 copies of counterspell, and or you could play call like I mentioned and have access to endurance, because endurance is the single best card in the living end matchup, in my opinion.
Yeah. I guess one card sitting on the sideline is, Yorion. Are there any tips and tricks to playing with the card aside from like, I have 8 mana, I'm just going to cast this because it does some good stuff and is a giant mull drifter? Like, are there any specific ways you're like looking to set up to like put spreading seas in specific spots, or like maybe wait for additional value, or like time your Teferis so that they are likely to survive to a flicker point, anything like that?
A lot of this stuff is pretty contextual. I will often try to put Yorion in hand whenever is convenient, and try not to pitch Yorion to Solitude if I can avoid it, unless it's a matchup where Yorion is likely not going to be relevant. But a cool thing about Yorion with Spreading Seas is that your opponent doesn't get priority before you get to choose what you put Spreading Seas on, since it just returns to the battlefield and you're not casting and targeting something. So that can kind of be cool. It gets around like specific permanent protection spells, or your opponents or if you're playing against this deck and you have like a blast zone, you're going to need to crack the blast zone before the Spreading Seas comes back into play, because you're not going to get a window to do that after.
Yeah, I've seen Yorion flicker Spreading Seas onto a Lotus Field, which was kind of gruesome to watch.
Ugh.
Yeah, I don't think that's the main thing keeping that deck down, but it doesn't help, to put it mildly. What are some other just general tips and tricks for someone looking to pick this deck up? Because I think, as compared to certainly a deck like Hammer, which has its own intricacies, definitely, but I think with 4-color, when all of your cards kind of do so many different things and have so many lines of text, and you're not working towards a clearly defined endpoint the way that Hammer is most of the time, I think it can seem quite daunting to know where to begin a lot of the time. So thinking back to when you were picking up the deck yourself, what were some of the things which you kind of either had to figure out, or maybe seemed a little counterintuitive at first, but ended up being quite important?
I think when learning the deck, I relied on a lot of heuristics, like how do I use my mana most efficiently is something that often came to mind. How do I get the most value out of each card that I have is another thing. And I guess tying back to that, the card expressive iteration is very, very powerful. However, I don't want to be forced to using it to hit a land drop. So I'll often like cast it. I'll often save it for a later turn in the game, even when casting it earlier might be the best use of mana, just because I want to hit 2 spells off of it.
Yeah, how often would you say that you find yourself needing to hedge against flooding with this deck? Because so many of your cards replace themselves, or they draw more cards, and that kind of fudges the ratio of lands to action in your deck past a certain point, when all of your spells are kind of low impact on the face of it, but then get you another card back in return. It seems like a lot of games with and against 4-color come down to 4-color has a bunch of cards in hand, but like a lot of those are lands, and some of them are maybe situational cards that aren't good in the matchup, and your position maybe from the other side isn't as bad as you think it is.
Yeah. When I was first picking up the deck, it felt kind of weird because I would have to mull like a number of one-landers, but also there were a lot of points in the game where I was just like drawing lands nonstop. So kind of finding a balance in between that was kind of tough. But I think that the main answer to flood is just getting as much value as you can out of each card, in addition to your companion Yorion. And I also added a 30th land, which is the Sheltered Thicket, because I wanted an additional card that could help me keep more hands that would otherwise be one-landers, while also not being a horrible top deck when I'm looking for action. Because Sheltered Thicket, I could just like cycle it for 2 mana, maybe hit a relevant spell, and bringing it back with Ren and 6 is very nice.
I think that covers most of the questions that people would have about this deck. If they want to see it in action, I know that you have recorded videos of your PTQ run, and I'm not sure what your current plans for those are, but if people want to find just your content with the deck, seeing it in action, piloted by someone who knows their stuff, where can they find that?
So I have my Twitter has most of the information for that. My Twitter is Sprung Levi, SprungLevi, and one of my more recent posts was the YouTube playlist with all my replays from that PTQ with commentary. And I also have a Twitch channel, which I pretty rarely stream on, but if I do, be sure to check it out. But yeah, that's it.
Yeah, well, the next question was going to be, where can people find you? And so you covered both of those in one fell swoop. So very nicely done there. Levi, thank you so much for joining us. And I think a lot of people will find this really useful.
Thanks a lot for having me, Dominari.
Anytime.
What's up, gamers? Ryan Overturf here to remind you to check out the 540, Star City Games' own Cube podcast, where each week myself and Ryan Sachs discuss anything and everything Cube Draft. From the perspective of Cube designers and drafters alike, we're tackling topics like deep dives into specific archetypes, Cube reviews for new sets as they release, and offering general insights for anybody interested in Magic's greatest format. Whether you're a seasoned Cube drafter or you haven't dipped your toes into the wonderful world of Cube just yet, I think you'll find the listen worth your time. Check out the 540 right here on StarCityGames.com and wherever you find your podcasts.
Okay, let's round this out with our nonsense of the week. And I tried to do it live this time around. I did not actually open this first link until just a few seconds ago, and I'm still reeling from what I set my eyes upon. I need to bleach them out somehow.
Yeah, well, so I saw this deck, and I saw that Ross had posted in advance that his article topic of the week was writing about how Dragon's Rage Channeler is overrated. I don't know exactly what context, maybe the other formats that are digital that card is legal in, but how can Dragon's Rage Channeler be overrated when it's enabling people to play Crack the Earth, Boom Bust, and Mana Tithe in Modern?
Yeah, you can go from 0 to hero in the blink of an eye. You can crack the earth, surveilling like an artifact or something, sacrificing your Urza Saga, and boom, that's Delirium on the spot.
Boom, got it. Yeah,
or literal boom, because we have four copies of Boom Bust alongside the 4 Crack the Earth, 4 Mana Tithe, which I guess is a form of land destruction, kind of.
Yeah, it's good with your other land destruction. I am like almost shocked that there isn't a single copy of the Boros Bridge for an indestructible land, but
yes,
maybe that's disrespectful in your Boros Luris deck, where your creatures are Ragavan, Dragon's Rage Channeler, and Esper Sentinel. Esper Sentinel, another great card when you are on the mono land destruction plan. Aside from the land destruction stuff, the cards in this deck are really good. Like you have Ragavan Channeler, Ending Bolt, Sentinel, Mishra's Bauble. I guess Chromatic Star to enable Crack the Earth is a little sketchy, but like it's also really good with Luris, so who am I to argue?
So when the boomers say to play the good cards, is this what they had in mind, do you think?
I think this is the kind of nonsense you're allowed to get away with in Modern, because like the good cards carry you to let you play whatever other cards, and like your goal with the other cards is to put cards in your deck that are good against stuff. And it feels like this is probably like, I don't know how 4-color defeats opponents that are double stone rating it.
I mean, I guess Ren and 6 is the answer to that question, as it is to most questions here.
Just be on the play, don't be on the draw, I guess.
Easy.
Don't get Mana Tithes.
Yeah, I do love this approach to Esper Sentinel too, of it's not, I'm going to try and win the game on turn 3 and you'll never have time to pay for your spells. Is I'm going to win the game on turn 12, maybe, but you're never going to be able to pay for Esper Sentinel. So you're going to pay, you're going to give me a card back regardless.
Yeah, we're going to play as if it is turn 3. This other deck. Okay, so, like that, like 90s 2000s trend of like when they would be like, it's a cracker, but we took out all the fat and all the milk, so we're just feeding you like a pile of sawdust. So someone has managed to do that with Titan Shift. So we have it looked like Titan Shift, and then I took another look, and there's no Titans and there's no shifts. Well, there is a shift in the sideboard, but this is Titanless, shiftless Titan Shift. It is Obosh the Prey Piercer, Arboreal Grazer, Dryad of the Elysian Grove, and Cursor of Crufix, alongside a bunch of lands that includes Valakut. It's got Hour of Promise, and then it can wish for the escape shift, but there's no Titans, there's no shifts. You're just Valakuting people the honest way, like I don't even know. But there's also Escaped the Wilds, and your deck has to be good if the card was banned in Standard, right?
Yeah, I see. What I'm choosing to believe here is that this player, Ohai Marked, great username by the way, really loves Obosh and was like, how can I put Obosh into this deck? I will make whatever sacrifices have to be made, come what may. And if that means cutting out both the Titans and the shifts of my Titan Shift deck, then, you know, I'm going to do what I have to do.
I do like how like Obosh really, really turbocharges Valakut. Like your first Valakut is double Valakut. Wait, it has
no
zero. Never mind. There is reminder text on the card to prevent that. See, this is the problem with Obosh is you just assume it makes everything work because all your cards normally dealing damage are these ones. But yeah, I wonder if there's some way. I guess there's Dwarven Mine as a forest. Maybe your lands all have to be mountains. You can't fit like Den of the Bugbear in here as just a way to kill.
Wait. Hey, look, we have a Keswick Wolfrun in the mana base for some reason.
That's the land that kills them if you can't Valakut them, I guess.
I guess so. I don't know how we're finding that because, once again, we don't have Primeval Titan in our deck. So we're just...
There's Hour of Promise. That's Primeval Titan.
Oh, okay. I take it back. I guess Spyfield Hazard is both a land that's not a mountain and also a spell. So that's fine as well. There was a list kind of similar to this, actually. A GINP, I think, was the screen name from one of the challenges. And they've been evolving that deck over time. And I kind of like the idea of a fair-ish Valakut deck that isn't all in on jumping from 2 to 4 to 6 every game, but can afford to kind of take it a little bit slower. And so their approach was, if the game goes long, well, I'm a Renin 6 Fury deck that also goes big with Primeval Titan, and so I can win all these grindy fights. But then also against the linear decks, well, I have Wish, and Wish can translate into, you know, Tormod's Crypt, Chalice of the Void, Alpine Moon, whatever I need to shut your linear deck down, yes, you, then I can get that on turn 3 most of the time. And so that's a nice way to kind of hedge against both halves of the format there.
Yeah, that sort of makes sense in that effect. I do wonder how well any of these decks actually handles like the Ragavan Death Shadow style things, but they are definitely playing the like go over the top with some flexibility against all the like random stuff deck. Like they probably cover 4-color and the linears, but I still am unsure of their shadow success.
Yeah, I think it may be the same effect that there have been times where like Amulet was the best way to play Primeval Titan, and then there have been other times where you would much rather be just old school Valakut or like the green-white Reclaimer deck, and that's usually when decks like Shadow are at the top of the format, or some kind of blue deck which can line up answers against your threats, and you need to attack from a different angle. And I don't know if this is where the format is at right now, but this is another approach which really benefits from Hammer dying down, because there's not much you can do to fix a Hammer matchup if fundamentally you're slower and you need a ton of resources and most of your interaction isn't even that good in the first place. That's just not a good recipe for success. But if dodging Hammer is a thing you can rely on doing, then maybe this is good enough elsewhere to make up for that.
Dodging Hammer,
maybe
hedging against Shadow. Yeah, maybe. I mean, we talked about this with like these decks that are trying to beat one or the other of Shadow and 4-color. So there is room for that kind of strategy to succeed now more than there was a week and a half ago.
Yeah, I guess we kind of gloss over the Tron deck from the PTQ, and that there was one high up in one of the challenges too. Maybe that is in that bucket too, where I think the Hammer matchup is just kind of untenable with that deck. But if you're good against Shadow, which it did seem like it was from watching those games, and you're good against 4-color, where okay, they have Spreading Seas, but they really, really need to draw Spreading Seas, probably 2 of them, then again, maybe it's you beat 2 of these and you lose to 1, and that's a gamble you can take.
Yeah, that does make some sense. Especially if you can find the week where 2 of the 3 are the big decks and the third is kind of hanging back.
So that's a small dose of nonsense for this week, but I'm sure we will have plenty more in the future. In the meantime, you can find me on Twitter at Dominaria. You can find Ari on Twitter at ARMLX. You can find our guest, Levi, on Twitter at Sprung Levi. Would definitely recommend giving him a follow, and then also checking out those replays from the PTQ that he came so close to winning with 4-color. Some really good free educational content there. And hopefully this was good free educational content for all of you. And if it wasn't, we'll try again next week. Take care, everyone.